Now, security researcher Mark Osborne will examine China's ongoing use of cyber intrusions. He'll not only be looking at how these intelligence collections are evolving from a technical lens, but also from a political, military, and socio-economic motivation too. It's a lot to pack in, so Mark, I know this is top of mind for lots of the folks joining us, and with that I won't take up any more of your time. Over to you.
Thanks, Julia. Hi everyone, hi, I'm Mark from the research team. As Julia said, we'll talk a little bit about malware and geopolitics, so hopefully a bit of something here for everyone. This talk is the A to Z of dominance, re-examining Chinese cyber threat in the age of the Xictionary. I know immediately many of you will now be thinking the age of the what, but no, this is not just some gimmick that I made up for a talk, it's a real thing. Xi Jinping is literally redefining the terms in which China is described. This is terminology that's being used by Xinhua, China's official state news agency. It's the same with the daily newspapers in China, the TV stations, and the various social media feeds put out by the Chinese state. It's literally everywhere. So, the age of the Xictionary. Just a quick detour at this point. I wanted to show this map to you for a couple of reasons. This shows the geographic spread of victim systems with a PlugX malware infection as captured by a sinkhole that we operated for a while earlier this year. This is just a snapshot summary of millions of connections that we received into the sinkhole. Each one of these blobs you see is a location with compromised computers that think they're calling out to a command and control server, instead of which they connected to us. As you can see, there are infected systems all over the world. There's also a notable detail on this map. And for many years now, I've been hearing about a supposed apocalyptic event known as the Cyber Pearl Harbor. Well, I have news, people. It's already here, and the sinkhole revealed it. But joking aside, remember this map. We'll be coming back to it later. So, back to Xi Jinping. In September 2017, the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee decided that Xi's political philosophies, generally referred to as Xi Jinping thought, would become part of the party constitution. This has also since become a component of the educational curriculum too, and at the same time, China removed the two-term limit for presidents, effectively giving Xi a term of office with no end, making one man very happy. Now, in most countries that aren't ruled by totalitarian state apparatus, we usually think of the government of a country as being at the top. It's the government that decides on economic and political strategy, creates laws, and so on. However, it's worth pointing out that in China, it's the party that rules. The Chinese Communist Party is at the top of the tree, and the government serves the party. So looking here, we see Li Qiang on the right, and he leads the government or the state council. The man at the top is no surprise. In March last year, Xi was awarded his third 5-year term as president. It was a bit of a foregone conclusion, as Xi had sidelined potential rivals and filled the top ranks of the party with his own supporters since taking power in 2012. Nevertheless, it's a democratic process, and you may like to know that the vote for Xi at the National People's Congress was 2,952 to 0. So Xi is president of the PRC, the General Secretary of the Central Committee, and chairman of the Central Military Commission, which is the body that runs the PLA. The armed forces, that is the PLA, are the armed wing of the party, not the government. So, moving along, adding to the previous diagram, we can now see how the military and intelligence agencies fit into the picture. The PLA structures on the left report to the CMC, and MSS structures on the right reporting to the State Council. But reality is always a bit blurry, and there are dotted line relationships all over the place. One of the more notable links is between the MSS and the United Front Workers' Department. The United Front is a party bureau without an obvious remit, but it kind of works like this. They reach out to all levels of Chinese society, home and abroad, that aren't already in some way participating in the party machinery. And then they ensure that everyone is working towards party goals, or at least not against them. This involves a lot of community building and social organising work, and it's often seen as a force for good. I think of these guys as like a Marxist-Leninist Freemasons. They can provide a path to representation, success, prosperity. but your continued prosperity will be dependent upon your obedience to the party. The United Front are also known to work with the MSS, as well as running their own intelligence operations. They're often associated with foreign influence ops, harassment of dissidents, and election interference. We recently saw cases of Christine Fang in the US and Christine Lee in the UK, both women alleged to be working for the United Front on long-term political influence campaigns and extremely well connected, even at the highest levels of government. In 2015, the 7 military regions of the PLA became the 5 theatre commands, and the old technical reconnaissance bureaus were absorbed into a new structure known as the Strategic Support Force. This seemed like quite a big deal at the time, but they've just reorganised again, and the old Strategic Support Force is now gone, replaced by a cyberspace force and an information support force, both newly created this year. So reform continues, and perhaps the SSF was always going to be a temporary structure anyway. What's happened practically speaking is that the PLA structure has flattened again, and the ISF and CSF come directly under Central Military Commission control. This gives the CMC better flexibility with provision of resources, particularly when creating joint forces for active duty. Some commentators that I've read suggest this may be something they've learned from observing US military structures. The CMC becomes more of a focal point, if you will, and remember who is running the CMC. So we've spoken a bit about how the PLA is organised, how it's reforming and the structures there, but what of the MSS? The MSS was for many years quite opaque to those of us in the West trying to follow the various threat group activities. In the early 2000s, the PLA was much noisier, much more prolific, and consequently much easier to follow. But several things changed that. Security vendors were publishing reports that called out China, network defenders were getting better, and those early smash and grab tactics no longer worked. Then came the Obama-Xi summit in 2015, and subsequently China's new national security law in 2017, both of which have contributed to a swing away from PLA and more towards MSS as being the natural home of cyber operations. But the organisation of MSS threat groups has remained hard to unravel, with a few notable exceptions. The MSS carries out most of its intel collection via a network of contractors and front companies run out of its regional state security bureaus. A great example of how the MSS works was revealed in the 2018 indictment of Yangjun Zhu. Yangjun was Deputy Division Director with the MSS's Jiangsu State Security Department. He was arrested in Belgium on April 1, 2018 and extradited to the US. The indictment documents released at this time, together with our existing knowledge of the Bronze Express threat group, painted a fascinating picture that reveals a lot about MSS operations. We saw a combination of cyber operations, insider threat, and traditional human intelligence all working together, and all facilitated by this single MSS intelligence officer. He was using government and university connections, along with his MSS front companies, to mask his real intent, obtaining vital engineering data from US aerospace companies. We've seen other similar examples. However, something else happened earlier this year that reveals much of MSS Intel Collect to be even more convoluted and messy. On 16th February this year, a GitHub repo appeared containing a data dump from Chinese security company iSoon, uploaded to the site by an unknown source. Some called this China's Snowden moment. This includes chat logs, product marketing materials, white papers, screenshots of demo products, and also examples of types of data stolen, clearly showing the companies involved in surveillance and intelligence collection. They even self-described their teams as being APTs. Since that time, the data has been removed, but what was there tells us such a lot about how the various MSS front companies and contractors are working. Looking at some of the chat logs between company leaders, we see them talking about intel collect they've got, what they think they can sell, and so on. It's particularly interesting and it helps to inform the way that we can see they work, showing that the company will hack victims speculatively for data they think they can sell, as well as perhaps just fulfilling specific customer requests. We also learned of a court case scheduled for October 2023, where the plaintiff, Chengdu 404, was suing the iSoon company in a software contract dispute. Chengdu 404, some of you might remember, are a company already identified as APT41 Bronze Atlas, and several members of which are already subject to US indictments. Okay, time to look at some threat group activity from earlier this year. Here we see a supposedly secret document that appears to have been authored by the senior military assistant to the Philippines Secretary of National Defence. The document refers to an incident at the Vietnamese embassy in Hanoi and also talks about proposed military patrols in the South China Sea. The US and Philippines military had indeed conducted joint patrols, and at the time, Chinese defence officials responded very publicly, urging the US to immediately stop meddling in the South China Sea issue. This document was in fact a malicious fake, built with a variant of the infamous Royal Road Maldoc builder. It drops a downloader executable to the victim's temp folder, which then subsequently calls out to a C2 for a follow-on payload. The downloader used a specific mutex value when executed that enabled us to link it with another malicious sample also targeted at Philippine military personnel. This second sample uses a file name that included a reference to a meeting with Colonel Peter Rowell of the US Army, and a quick search online reveals that the Colonel had indeed visited with Philippine colleagues at the end of 2023. Also, this past 12 months, we've seen China-based threat groups targeting the semiconductor industry. Here we analysed a self-extracting archive that contained a trio of files for a DLL sideload, together with a decoy document. The decoy was copied from a Taiwanese energy-saving website. The file name translates to Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, and the content suggests that the intended targets were likely to be Chinese-speaking individuals working in the semiconductor industry. This malware decrypts and executes a Cobalt Strike payload contained within the bin.config file. The payload has the appearance of a normal executable, but it does have a shellcode header typical of Cobalt Strike stageless payload artifacts. We see this kind of style of payload a lot with China-based threat groups. In July this year, we also looked at another Bronze President campaign that affected multiple countries. That included Taiwan, Japan, Vietnam, Kazakhstan, Serbia, Philippines, and Mongolia. Most of the observed malicious samples were all named meeting_invitation, and they used an Adobe PDF icon to entice users to open them. In fact, these were all malicious MSC files, which was a bit of a novelty. If opened, these are executed by the Microsoft Management Console, prompting the victim to click a link, which masquerades as either a PDF or Word document. Clicking that link executes a PowerShell command that downloads and executes another file, a malicious MSI, from a staging server. That then goes on to drop and execute 3 further files for a DLL sideload installing plugx onto the victim system. Again, we can see Bronze President's typical payload style with a shellcode file header. The file names, paths and payloads in this campaign all link back to previous Bronze President activity in 2023 that had targeted European MFAs as well as individuals involved with human rights work, using appropriate decoy files for each target as you see here. In August of this year, we also looked at another Bronze President campaign using the TinyNote downloader, this time involved in attacks against Myanmar. The TinyNote sample was an executable file with the rather convoluted name Documents from Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan.exe, and we managed to link this TinyNote sample to an older one that was first uploaded to VirusTotal by a user in Latvia back in February 2023. Now in early 23 we were also looking at Latvia, as at that time we'd seen Bronze President deploying a malware called MQ Shell in various attacks against European nations that did also include Latvia. The 2023 attacks used very similar file names to our TinyNote sample, and you can see some examples here, such as PDF passport and CVs of diplomatic members from Tokyo of Japan.exe, similarly convoluted with long file names with an exe. But my takeaway point here is that a lot of people watching this might think, hey, why do I care what malware some random threat actor deploys in Myanmar? But as shown, the answer is probably quite simple. Watch what happens in Myanmar today. It could be here tomorrow. And these guys will repeat their TTPs. So, a quick word about targeting. which on the whole is really very broad and quite difficult to explain in a succinct way. But I'll try. So there are some obvious targets like Taiwan and all the Southeast Asian and South China Sea neighbours with their numerous land and sea territorial disputes. And then potentially military opponents will always be obvious targets. So that would be the Five Eyes plus India and Japan at a minimum. But I think probably the biggest driver by far is political and economic influence. China will bring to bear many different resources in their efforts to shape the world order as they desire. And using cyber-enabled Intel Collect can support many of those efforts. So this brings many industries into scope. Think manufacturing, construction, agriculture, utilities, education, healthcare, and many others. So think of China's business interests, and you quickly see that a lot of things can be influenced with the right information. Trade negotiations and tariffs, subsidies, legal and governance challenges, investment projects, infrastructure building and finance, all of these things can become intelligence collection targets. And that's before you even start thinking about specific industries that might be of particular interest. We spoke at another event recently about China's domination of rare earth metals, an essential component for clean energy, medical applications, computing, and military hardware. China has positioned itself at the centre of global supply chains, completely dominating the market for rare earths, especially on the processing side. The rest of the world is literally decades behind and scrambling to catch up. Back in the 1980s, rare earth production was spread around many countries, but then along came China, with their state-owned enterprises, with their various subsidies, unencumbered with the need to make a profit or hampered with environmental regulation, and they pretty much wiped out the existing industry. They lowered prices to the point that no one could compete, put the competition out of business, then moved in and took over, eventually bringing prices back up again once they completely dominated the industry. A lot of Chinese trade and investment gravitates towards countries with resources that can be extracted and processed. For example, copper from Serbia and Peru, lithium from Chile, cobalt, iron ore, manganese and various others from various sub-Saharan African countries. The list is virtually endless. And geographically speaking, China's appetite for natural resources aligns very nicely with its Belt and Road Initiative, which brings us all back to where we started. So if you remember the map with the Plug X victims, have another look. It's clear to see that actually there are compromised systems all over the world, and think to yourself, well, this is just one particular version of one particular piece of malware, this Plug X from Bronze President. This is probably just the tip of a very large iceberg. But it's interesting to see where the data clumps up, and there are clearly a lot of infections in West Africa, for example. So I thought I'd overlay a couple of other interesting things for you to have a look at. Here you see the main arteries of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and you can see that this makes quite a good match for the locations of Plug X compromise. There are also many smaller links that you don't see as well. For example, the blue line of maritime trade that joins onto East Africa lands in Kenya at Mombasa, and from there the route heads inland on the brand new Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway, which is one of Xi Jinping's flagship African projects. And now here's the same map again, but this time we've overlaid the locations of some of China's biggest mining and mineral extraction investments. I'm not saying this is conclusive proof of anything, but I've been doing this for a long time. And China's cyber operations do have a tendency to follow wherever Chinese economic interest lies. So, to wrap up a very quick session there, pay attention to Xi Jinping. Pay attention to the party and the state media. The messages they deliver are coherent and very well crafted. Yes, there is always an element of propaganda and political gamesmanship, but they are clearly telling us the things that they care about. There are no surprises here. Economic success, military and political influence on the world stage, and all of this viewed through the lens of the party. New China TV and Xinhua are continuously pumping out messaging that has adopted the Xictionary as its point of reference. These news channels talk about things like the China-Africa community with a shared future in their slick, well-produced propaganda pieces. Their intention is clear. Thank you. Julia.
Mark, thank you so much. Really fascinating to get that insight. And like I said, he packed a lot in into that 15 minutes.
Tried.
You nailed it. Just one thing then from me before I let you go. With the insights that you've shared there, the many insights that you've shared, but particularly around the evolution of cyber intrusions from China, what steps now, with that knowledge at their disposal, would you suggest that the IT and cyber communities on this video would take immediately after this?
Okay, so it's kind of a big question, and I think in the past I've answered similar questions by talking about the types of IT security controls that you might want to put in place, or how to go hunting for threats in your environment, that kind of thing. And all of that is really great stuff. But I think I'm talking to a fairly mature audience today, and I think I'd like people to go away with this thought when thinking about advanced cyber threats from China. Think about how you would go away, sit down and try to detect the insider threat in your network. Think about how you would look in your logging or look in your business processes to detect the malicious insider. Because I think a sophisticated adversary doesn't look like a piece of malware or doesn't look like a cyber intruder. They tend to look like one of your own employees. And that's because of the privilege that they've gained and the credentials that they can use once they're in your environment. So think of that.
So read in between the lines, as well as reading the lines and everything on the outside too.
Yeah.
Well, listen, that is really helpful. Thank you so much for sharing there. That, like I say, was security researcher for SecureWorks, Mark Osborne. And up next, we have Rafe Pilling with his session titled The Winding Road to Attribution.